Okay, ji. So forces and equilibrium, lecture number 4. Today we'll be working more on equilibrium. What is an equilibrium? An equilibrium is an object is in equilibrium when the following conditions are fulfilled. Condition number 1, algebraic sum of all forces about a point are equal to 0. Number 2, sum of clockwise momentum is equal to sum of anti-clockwise about an axis of rotation, or I can say about a point, about the point. So whenever we have equilibrium, we'll always say that the sum of the summation of horizontal should be equal to 0, or the summation of vertical forces to be equal to 0. Let's say example of this can be related to, let's say, that there is an object and there is a force applied 100 Newton on the right hand side, and let's say there's a force that is x Newton on the left hand side, and the question says it is an equilibrium. The question says it is an equilibrium. So what we need to understand is that summation of equilibrium forces should be equal to what? 0, which means right minus left should be equal to 0. Or we can even say right should be equal to left. So to have the equilibrium state, even if we have this, so that should mean that x Newton should also be 100 Newton, so that the object should not move. So the answer for this should be 100 Newton to have the equilibrium state. So this was your horizontal force. Now let's work on the vertical force. Let's say that another example, if there is an object, right, and there is a force acting upwards, that should be 200 Newton. So there should be a force that should be acting downwards. Let's take it as y Newton. So when we have vertical force, we can always relate this to that your submission of force vertical should be equal to what? 0 for equilibrium. Equilibrium, which means up minus down should be equal to 0. Up minus down should be equal to 0, or up is equal to downwards. So if your up, let's say downwards is y Newton, and your upward is 200 Newton. So your Y should be directly 200 Newton as well, because it says up is what? Up is 200 Newton and down is Y Newton. So we can directly refer to what? Y Newton is equal to what? 200 Newton. So to have the equilibrium state. Now let's just say another type of example. Let's just say that we have a force that is moving diagonally towards right, and there's a force that is moving diagonally towards the left. This can be Y Newton. Let's take this as X Newton. There's an angle of 30. There's an angle of 60. And there's a downward force as well of 200 Newton. There's a downward force of well as 200 Newton. And the question refers directly to what? The resultant of three forces is 0, which means equilibrium. Question says find value of X and Y. Now this is an example question. So the resultant of the three forces is 0. Find the value of X and Y. Now, to continue this, what we need to understand is that it is an equilibrium state, number one. Number two, what more important is that you need to understand the vertical and the horizontal forces that are applied. So if we just say that there will be an horizontal force with this, and there is also vertical. So this is acting right and this is acting towards up. So what we can say is that this is X sine 30 and this is X cos 30. Similarly, on the other hand, if you see, there's a force going towards left and there's a force going towards up, with the state that this is Y sine 60 and Y cos 60. So in short, if you understand this, there are in total of three forces that are acting upward. There are a total of two forces that are acting upward. One, two. And there is one force that is acting downwards. So the sum of the upward force should be equal to the sum of the downward force. Whereas if you see, there is only one force that is moving on the right, and there is one force that is moving on the left. So the sum of the vertical force or horizontal force moving on the right hand side is equal to the sum of the horizontal force that is moving on the left hand side. So if we just solve this, considering that we already know that what is the horizontal and the vertical force. So summation of force horizontal should be equal to what? 0. So can we just say that right is equal to what? Left. So this should be X cos 30 is equal to what? Y cos 60. And knowing the fact that cos 30 is under root 3 upon 2. So this should be under root 3 upon 2 is equal to Y, and cos 60 is what? 1 upon 2. So if 2 and 2 are cancelled, that means what we are left with, Y is equal to under root 3 X. Now we know from this right is equal to left, we end up having what? Under root 3 X. Now this becomes your equation 1. Now this is your equation 1. Using what? Using the horizontal force, which was equal to 0, because the forces were applicable to what? Three forces are applicable towards 0. So we know that it is at equilibrium state. Considering that it is at equilibrium state, we now know that it is what? Under root 3 x, y is equal to under root 3x when we use right and the left force. Now let's just work upon the upward and the downward force, right? So in this case, if you just notice that we have an upward and downward force, so this should be summation of F vertical should be equal to what? 0. So this is upward is equal to what? Downward. The upward force is equal to what? Downward force. Now, the upward force that we have here is x sine 30 plus x sine 60. X sine 30 plus x sine 60, which is equal to what? 200 Newton. And sine 30 is what? 1 upon 2. Whereas sine 60 is under root 3 upon 2. And this whole thing is equal to what? 200. If we just see that 202 is being the denominator, we can easily take down this thing as x plus under root 3x is equal to 400. Is equal to what? 400. Now we know this, that we already knew what was, we already had what? X, let me just correct one particular thing here. We had sine y. So this will be your y from this side. So this should be y sine 60, y under root 3 upon 2 and under root 3y. So we now know one thing, that is that in the first equation, we already had the equation of y, that was what? Y was this, under root 3x, right? So in place of y, we can have under root 3x. So in place of y, we can always write down under root 3x, considering that. Now, let's just say that we have under root 3x. So x plus under root 3 and under root 3x can be used, is equal to what? 400. So this will be under root 3 is 3. So this should be x plus 3x is equal to what? 400. 4x is equal to what? 400. So x becomes 100 Newton. Now we know that x is 100 Newton, and we found out earlier that y was what? Under root 3x, right? So we can directly use y is equal to under root 3, and in place of x, we can use 100. So the value of y here will be 173.2 Newton. So now that we know that this becomes what? Your x is, in this question, your x is 100 Newton and y becomes what? 173.2 Newton. And we all did this because we knew that the question was related towards the equilibrium, knowing the fact that upward force is equal to downward force and right is equal to what? Left. Okay, let's just work upon another example question. Here it is. So this is 200 x Newton, 200, 300 Newton and y Newton, right? So let's just work upon the different values. Let's say this will be y sine theta and y. This will be x sine 30, x cos 30. On the left hand side, if you see, there are two forces. They're acting towards left and up. So this should be 200 cos 60 and 200 sin 60. There's a 300 as well, which is force that is being applied towards the left hand side, but that is to be treated very differently. So what we know is that we have in total, there are two upward forces, one downward force. There is one force that is acting towards right, but there are two forces that are acting towards left, which is 300 and 200. So let's just work upon the horizontal force, and then we can work upon the vertical force again. Let's just say that we have summation of force horizontal that is equal to what? 0, since it is at equilibrium state. So right minus left, right is equal to what? Left. So right is x cos 30, where left can be 300 plus 200 cos 60. So what we can have is x cos 30 is under root 3 upon 2 is equal to 300. This would be 200. Cos 60 is 1 upon 2. Right? So this should be under root 3 upon 2 is equal to 300 plus 100. So x under root 3 is equal to 300 plus 100 is 400. 400 multiplied by 2 becomes what? 800. So x is equal to 800 upon under root 3. Your x becomes 461.9 Newton. This will be 461.9 Newton, which obviously you can take it as 462. Now, let's just work upon the what vertical forces as well. So submission force vertical is also equal to 0, which means up is equal to what? Down. Up minus down is equal to 0. We can have up is equal to what? Down, because of the force equilibrium, right? So the forces that are acting upwards are 200 sine 60 and x sine 30. So 200 sine 60 plus x sine 30 is equal to the downward force, which is y. Now we already know that sine 60 is equal to what? Under root 3 upon 2. So this is under root 3 upon 2 plus x 1 upon 2 will be sine 30, which is equal to y. Now this should be 100 into under root 3 plus, and x is 461.9. We'll be taking the exact value here. So if I calculate y, your y will be 404.2 Newton. So these are the two answers that we have. That means x is equal to what? 461 Newton, 461.9 Newton, whereas y is equal to 404.2 Newton. So these are the two examples that we did for the equilibrium of the forces when we have the multiple forces that to be considered.